117 Facing the Bount. The Bount didn't hesitate to split up, dividing their enemies amongst each other. They didn't seem to be too worried about being outnumbered. Ichigo dashed forward, swinging his Zanpakuto, blocking Korea's advance himself. "You're not going anywhere," he shouted. Korea smirked and blocked the Zanpakuto with his bare hand, stopping him in place. "What?" Ichigo yelled out, surprised to have his attack blocked so easily. Korea pushed forward on Ichigo's blade, sending him flying backwards until he crashed into the wall surrounding Uraira's store, sending dust and chunks of brick flying around. "It won't be that easy," he said. Ichigo quickly crawled out of the rubble and, using Shunpo, dashed back towards Korea. He swung multiple times from different angles, but each was intercepted by Korea's index finger. "You won't get past me," Ichigo yelled. Korea shook his head. "Only one of us needs to succeed. It's just a matter of time," he said. Renji didn't hesitate and acted the moment Ichigo went on the offensive. "Howl! Zabumaru!" he yelled, transforming his katana-shaped Zanpakuto into its large toothed sword whip shike form. He rushed towards a young male-looking Bount with the fringe of his orange hair covering one of his eyes. The Bount didn't hesitate to summon his doll on the palm of his hand. It had the head of a mouse with red fur, but its body seemed to consist of a flower. The Bount smirked. "Ritz. Show him what you're capable of," he said. The doll jumped from his hand and buried into the ground. It was so fast it was hard to keep track of. Renji stared at the ground warily. It suddenly burst out of the ground by his feet and rushed towards his head. He barely managed to turn his head, avoiding a direct hit, but leaving a scratch across the side of his face that started dripping with blood. He swung his Zanpakuto, whipping the blades towards it, but it zipped between the segments and quickly buried into the ground again before he could catch it. A large middle-aged tan male Bount with a full beard and orange faux hawk summoned a large female Joragumo arachne made out of metal. Its lower body was made out of large metal ball segments and spider-like limbs that ended in sickle-like blades, while its metal upper body was shaped like a woman. She looked around and smiled. "Ah! So many possible playthings to choose from. Who shall I pick?" she said in a teasing tone. Chad said nothing, but raised his fists and faced her fearlessly. She looked at him and her smile widened. "Oh my. The strong silent type," she said. Basketball-sized metal balls started forming from her body and hovering around her menacingly. "Don't mind the love taps," she said, sending them flying towards Chad. Chad frowned and watched the balls closely. Before they could reach him, he weaved between them towards her, deflecting those he couldn't dodge to the side with his transformed arm. As they landed on the ground, they sent dirt and rocks flying in all directions from the impact. "It looks like you can take a beating. How delightful." "In that case," she said. Her sickle blade hands transformed into the shape of gun barrels from the forearms down, and she aimed both at Chad. Some round eye-like objects with yellow sclera and red pupils tried to stealthily attack Inoue in the back. Jinta jumped in front of her and swung his kanabo, sending the nearest ones flying away. Yuru simply ran amongst them, wearing some white and red boxing gloves, punching and kicking them away. Her pink and white polka-dotted skirt fluttering behind her. "Bagan. Hinajuku. Lily. Santon Kasun. I reject," Inoue shouted. 3 of the leaves on the silver flower hairpins in her hair glowed golden and flew out from it in streaks of golden light, before connecting and forming a triangle of gold light, shielding herself and Tessai from the few eyes that managed to get past Jinta and Yuru, causing them to slam into it futilely. While they were keeping the doll busy, Tessai placed his palms together. "Light that chases darkness. Links that bind the heavens to earth. Seize and kneel towards the horizon. Find the light and bloom," he said. He stretched one palm out towards the eyes and clenched it into a fist. "Bakudo number 63, Seijo Sabaku," he said. A shining golden chain formed in front of him and rushed towards the eyes, wrapping around them tightly. The middle-aged Bount with parted brown hair ignored everyone and dashed directly towards Uraira's store instead. Before he was even able to make it to the front door, he suddenly disappeared into a black and red wormhole, reappearing a few feet farther away with a confused look on his face. Rairin, Kurido and Noba faced him. "Good job, Noba-kun," Kurido shouted. Rairin glared at Ryo. "Stop right there," she shouted. Ryo glared at the 3 of them. "You really think you can stop me?" he asked. A golden snake slithered down his arm. He grabbed onto its tail as if it were a whip and slashed wildly around himself, leaving long gouges all across the ground between them. They looked at him warily. Suddenly those gouges glowed and turned into more snakes that looked just like the one he was using as a whip. He smirked. "I would like to see you try," he said. The snakes dashed towards Kurido, who was standing nearest. He seemed to panic, but they passed through him as if there was nothing there before he simply disappeared. He appeared a few feet away, smiling widely. "Nice try," he said. Ryo kept attacking them, but every attack he did either ended up passing through them or being swallowed by those wormholes. He hadn't even been able to put a scratch on any of them. Unfortunately for them, they had been on the defensive the entire time, leading to the current stalemate. 118 The Fisherman and Her Soul. Raina swung her staff, sending a burst-off fire towards an elderly-looking male bount facing her. Before the fire could reach him though, his doll, looking like a large stone fish, dove out of the ground as if it were water and swallowed the fire whole. "That was rather rude of you, young lady," the old male bount said. Raina frowned. "Where did that fish doll come from? And what happened to my attack? It didn't seem to do anything to it." She wondered. The doll dove back into the ground as if it was water and started circling the elderly male bount with its fin sticking out above the surface of the ground. The elderly man licked his lips. "Your soul must be quite delectable," he said. Raina frowned. "That's disgusting, you old fart," she said. He frowned. "It seems I must teach you some manners first," he said. She shook her head. "We'll just have to see about that," she said. He knocked the tip of his cane onto the ground. "Bora, let's go," he said. The large fish fin appeared from the ground again, circling his location before suddenly disappearing into the ground again. Raina looked around cautiously. What's he up to? She wondered. The old bount simply stood there wearing a self-satisfied smirk. She noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Did the ground just turn darker? She asked herself. Upon closer inspection, she noticed there was a round area around here where the ground around her was darker and it seemed to be growing. Suddenly the fish doll, Bora's, mouth emerged from the ground surrounding her as it propelled itself from the ground like a whale from the ocean. Due to noticing something was off, she barely managed to escape from the bite using her imitation of the Quincy high-speed movement technique Hirankyaku. She disappeared from her current position, appearing a few feet outside of Bora's range. The fish submerged itself into the ground once again upon landing. "Oh, you're better than I expected, young lady. Let me introduce ourselves. You've earned at least that much. I'm Saitari and this is my doll." Bora, the old bount said. The fish-like doll reappeared next to Saitari. "You called me out on a nice night. It feels good," a deep rumbling voice resounded from the stone fish-like doll Bora. Raina looked surprised. "It talks," she exclaimed. Saitari frowned. "Of course he talks, you stupid girl," he chided. She shook her head and smirked. "It won't much longer," she said while pointing her staff towards it. Fire didn't work. What about the other elements though? She wondered. Moisture from the air collected above the head of her staff and quickly froze into a giant lance of ice. She swung her staff, sending it hurtling towards the side of Bora's head. To her dismay, it simply turned its head and swallowed it just like it had her flames. Saitari smirked. "You're just wasting your time, young lady. Bora, why not have some more fun?" he said. The fight continued with Raina dodging Bora's attacks and using the openings to fire off attacks from all the different elements she could summon. She was sweating a little from all the running she was doing dodging the attacks. One wrong move and things are over. Fire, ice, lightning, earth, wind. Everything I try either just passes through it or gets swallowed though, she thought nervously. She tried to recall of all the details of the fight so far when her eyes suddenly widened. Whenever one of my attacks gets close enough to possibly hit that disgusting old man, the fish never phases through my attacks, but always swallows them. That can't be a coincidence. If it phased, then the attack would pass through and might hit the old man. The fact that it is swallowing all of those must mean they are a threat to the old man. He is the weak point in the equation, she realized. She looked at Saitari. Her gaze hardened as she made up her mind. They continued to go back and forward, but Raina seemed to be running out of steam. Bora's attacks were getting closer and closer as she grew more exhausted. Her attacks grew fewer and fewer with her feeble attempts at resisting. Saitari licked his lips. "How tasty she must be," he said to himself excitedly. She dashed away from the two, but in her exhaustion she stumbled after dodging. A look of panic spread across her face. Sawatari's smile widened. "We've got her. Finish her, Bora," he said. Bora quickly pursued after her. She tried to crawl back from it, but it was futile. Its gaping maw looming over her when suddenly Sawatari noticed a smirk on her lips that didn't belong there. "No," he yelled. It was too late though. "Gotcha," Raina thought. The exhaustion seemed to have been an illusion as Raina disappeared from in front of Bora's mouth, reappearing closer to Sawatari. Before Bora had even managed to submerge into the ground again, she summoned her fastest element, lightning. Multiple bolts of lightning snaked their way towards the now completely unguarded Sawatari. It was so fast it hit him directly in the chest before either of them could even react to the sudden shift. The electricity coursed through his body, searing his flesh. The place it had landed burnt away his clothes and charred the skin black. RHHHHH. Sawatari let out a shrill scream. He fell to his knees. He remained motionless, but didn't go down all the way. "Sawatari!" Bora yelled. It quickly swam towards Sawatari, and to Raina's surprise it didn't stop, but jumped out of the ground towards Sawatari. It opened its mouth and swallowed Sawatari whole before submerging into the ground again. Did it eat him? She thought in confusion. She looked around warily, but to her surprise neither of them reappeared. 119 Schwarzlicht. A young-looking female bount with long dark green hair wearing a kaipe faced Masaki with a smirk. She summoned her doll, which consisted of a Chinese sword in one hand and a bladed fan in her other. The two parts were connected by a chain. "I'd rather fight a man than a woman," the green-haired bount said. A mouth opened up on the guard of her sword. "It's all the same as long as you defeat her," it said with a masculine voice. "I thought you'd say that," the bount responded. She looked over Masaki and licked her lips. "You certainly look beautiful though. It's making me excited. Let's have some fun together," she said. Masaki shook her head. "I think I might be a little too much fun for you," she said dismissively. The female bount smirked. "That's impossible," she said confidently. Masaki didn't hesitate. She raised her arm and fired a spirit arrow in the blink of an eye. It hurtled straight towards the bount's head. She managed to deflect it using the fan, but the arrow managed to leave a scratch on it in the process. "Oh, how feisty. I like it," the bount said. Despite her effort to conceal it, Masaki could tell her smirk had grown more strained. She was taking her far more seriously now than she had before. A mouth opened on the fan. "How dare she do that to me?" it screeched in a feminine voice. Masaki glanced over at Raina, but smiled when she noticed she was still holding up all right. She hadn't been entirely confident in Raina's performance against humans or human-like enemies. So far the only things she had killed or seriously harmed were regular hollows. It wasn't hard to attack someone that monstrous. It was much harder to attack something that looked human. She couldn't help but be proud to see her student performing so well under pressure. The bount threw the fan straight at Masaki, who easily dodged it. The fan crashed into the ground, causing a small explosion of dirt and dust to be thrown up. Masaki fired off a volley of spirit particle arrows. The bount rapidly thrust the sword part of her doll to destroy the arrows. She smirked. "Well, aren't you a cute little bunny jumping all around the place," she said. Masaki shut her up with another volley of arrows. "Let's kick things up a notch," she thought. She started cycling her spirit power through her legs in a specific pattern to reinforce them and started dashing around the bount, even stepping on the air, utilizing Hirankyaku and leaving behind multiple after images, confusing the bount, who was unable to keep up with the increased speed. Multiple arrows came flying from completely different directions. The bount barely managed to deflect two before having to roll in the dirt to dodge the others. She frowned. She swung the fan in a wide sweeping circle around her by the chain. Masaki blocked it with the limb of her spirit energy bow, but doing so stopped her momentum. The moment the bount found her, she dashed towards Masaki and unleashed a series of rapid stabs towards her with the sword. Masaki managed to dodge and parry all of her attacks. She smiled. "You're weaker than I expected," she said. The fan portion of the doll chuckled. "Did you hear that, Yoshi? Are you going to let her get away with that?" it asked. Yoshi's attacks sped up, but all she was achieving was exhausting herself. Masaki dashed backwards out of range of her sword, but Yoshi responded by throwing the fan towards her. Masaki blocked it with her bow. The force sent her sliding back, which she made use of to send herself back further out of range. Using Hirankyaku, she started circling her again. They kept going back and forth with no one seeming to have the upper hand. What Yoshi didn't notice until too late was that not all the arrows fired were aimed for her, nor did all of them disappear. She was too occupied trying to stay alive by barely dodging and blocking the many arrows sent her way to pay attention to it. Masaki suddenly came to a halt, surprising her. Yoshi found herself surrounded by 8 slightly different-looking energy arrows fired into the ground at an equal distance from each other. Unlike the other arrows fired, they had a small bone-like portion at the rear of the shaft. Masaki stood by one of them with a smile. "Oh, you finally noticed? A little too late though," she said. She raised her hand over the arrow she was standing by. Using the sharp thumbnail of the bone gauntlet covering her hands, she sliced through her index finger. A single drop of her blood, which glowed with a purple hue, dripped down onto the tip of the arrow. She looked at Yoshi with a serious gaze. "Sprenger Schwarzlicht," she said. A pulse of more vibrant purple energy traveled down the black and purple shaft of the 8 arrows into the ground, where they traveled to meet at the center where Yoshi still stood. The arrows then connected to one another with more lines of the purple and black spirit power forming an octagon surrounding her. A thin purple and black column of light erupted from the middle where the spirit power lines coming from the arrows connected. The blast shot straight up through Yoshi and spread towards the edges of the octagon, destroying everything it met. "Kaya!" Yoshi and her doll screamed in unison. The blast was so vibrant. Once it spread far enough to cover all of Yoshi, the only thing that remained visible was a darker silhouette. If you looked close enough though, it could be seen that the silhouette was slowly disintegrating. Eventually the blast faded away, but there was nothing remaining in the octagonal area the blast had covered. 120 Throwing bait. Middle of nowhere, Hueco Mundo. Tsuruxi, Mila Rose and Hisashi had spent a few days traveling to the destination of their missions. But to Hisashi's surprise, she seemed to be acting no different than usual, which meant cold, dismissive and belligerent towards him at every chance, while trying to talk with and fawn over Mila Rose to try to get into her good graces. He didn't care about her mistreatment of him as long as it remained at just words. Do you get mad when a small child jumps up and down in front of you and insults you, or do you just shake your head judging it a silly child? Tsuruxi might think she stands towering over him, but even without becoming an reincarnate, she was still quite a bit weaker than him. On top of that, if he did react to put her in her place, that would only put a greater spotlight on himself as being powerful in the eyes of the others in Las Noches, which was the last thing he wanted. Hisashi looked at her suspiciously. Strange, is she really not planning on something? He wondered to himself. He had felt some malicious gazes staring at them from the distance every so often. All throughout the trip he had been feigning weakness, acting like Mila Rose was the strongest one out of the two of them, letting her take on the strongest hollows they came across and acting like he could barely keep up at times when facing multiple enemies. All in hopes of baiting out some kind of response, but nothing had happened yet. They had left the sandy dunes of Hueco Mundo's surface and were dashing between the trees in the forest of Menos now. They had been tracking some traces they found hours before. "Do you think the Ajuches will agree to join Las Noches?" Mila Rose asked. She sounded reluctant. Hisashi chuckled. "Worried you won't get the fight you've been craving?" he asked. Mila Rose shrugged. "I've been growing restless cooped up in Las Noches. Although some peace is nice, it sometimes feels wrong," she said. Tsuruxi frowned. "Does it even matter? They'll just be a bunch of weaklings." "They always are," she said dismissively. "I just hope they can at least put up a little of a fight. I don't want it to be over without being able to let loose a little," Mila Rose said. "From my experience, they almost always refuse at first, so you'll probably get your wish. Given how this one has been collecting subordinates and building his own faction, I doubt he will submit without a fight. Maybe even that won't be enough. I'm fine either way. As long as you have fun," Hisashi said. The thing that had been bothering him was he was feeling stifled. Between Tsuruxi's presence and whoever's gaze he kept feeling. He had to hold back at all times and act like he was much weaker than he was, just in case they might notice and report it back. He couldn't wantonly kill and consume whenever other hollows attacked their groups to fuel his growth. Why can't they just grow a pair and attack? He wondered. Tsuruxi sneered. They heard the scream of a Jillian. It tried to charge Acero, but one slash of Hisashi's arm sent off an energy blade that cleanly sliced the giant in half before it could even finish charging the attack. They didn't even slow down or comment on it. At their level, it was no different than stepping on an ant that happened to walk in your path. Mila Rose smiled. "I hope you're right," she said. So who is going to do the talking? He asked. As the highest ranked it should obviously be me, Saruxi said arrogantly. Hisashi shook his head. If we do that I can guarantee it'll be a fight, he said. Saruxi narrowed her eyes while glaring at him. Oh. Let's let her do it then. Mila Rose chimed in. This seemed to distract Saruxi. If you think that's for the best, she said. Hisashi shrugged. He stopped running and crouched down by some tracks. These tracks are still quite fresh. We must be getting close, he said. At least he isn't totally useless, Saruxi said. Mila Rose frowned. They continued following the tracks until they came to a large clearing. There seemed to be a rudimentary temple and throne that made Hisashi roll his eyes. Arrogance and delusions of grandeur weren't all that uncommon amongst the hollows once their consciousness grew stronger after moving past the Jillian stage. There was a large bulky gorilla-like Ajuchas with deep blue fur sitting on the throne. Its mask looked like the skull of some kind of monkey. It was surrounded by many other Ajuchas. The moment they walked into the clearing the Ajuchas went quiet. They looked at the newcomers curiously. The gorilla Ajuchas stood up from his throne towering over those below. Who are they? He asked. His subordinates were looking at each other murmuring trying to figure out if anyone had brought them. The gorilla Ajuchas slowly walked down from the temple. Depending on how strong you are, maybe just maybe you can join us, he said. Hisashi looked at Saruxi. Isn't it your turn now? He asked. Saruxi frowned. Don't tell me what to do, she bit back. Despite her shorter stature than the gorilla she still gave off the feeling of looking down on him with her sneer. If his expression was any indication he wasn't a fan of it. You should be happy, we're here to give you miserable rats scurrying around the corners of Hueco Mundo a shot at being part of something greater. Our master Aizen has seen it fit to extend his hand and offer you the opportunity to join Los. No chase, she said. The gorilla clenched its fist slowly approaching her. She wore a self-satisfied smirk. All you have to do is kneel and submit, she said. That'll do it, Hisashi thought.